A few years after the end of World War I, Congress passed a law saying that veterans of that war were entitled to a bonus for their service. In 1924, Congress said American veterans of the First World War had earned a bonus of $1,000. But here's the catch. It could not be paid for about 20 more years. They couldn't collect it until 1945, or their families could collect it upon their death if that came before 1945. Well, along the way, the country fell into the Great Depression. Americans were starving to death. They were on bread lines. And the veterans who knew that $1,000 was owed to them by the government decided that they would much rather collect that now, please. That money was owed to them. They had earned it, and they needed it to feed their families now. So in the spring of 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, the veterans marched into Washington because they wanted payment of that bonus they had earned in World War I. They were called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army set up as an encampment in Washington, D.C., tens of thousands of people in a living political protest. History tells us that they kept their instant city clean. They integrated their camp racially, which was really quite radical at the time. We know that they grew gardens for food. They settled in for as long as it might take to make their point to Congress and to then President Herbert Hoover. At least that's what the Bonus Army hoped. The head of the U.S. Army, General Douglas MacArthur, looked out at the peaceful protest of those veterans camping out and saw an embarrassment for his commander-in-chief. MacArthur mustered troops on horseback against the veterans' camp and followed those horses with tanks. The destruction began.
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, "The blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life." The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
2 U.S. veterans were killed that day, but the movement grew. What does not kill you makes you stronger, they say. News of the raid, the first footage of what had happened, reached Americans in movie houses on newsreels that they used to show in theaters before the main feature. As Frank Rich describes in New York Magazine this week, when Americans saw those newsreels of MacArthur's army destroying the veterans' protest camp, Americans applauded the Bonus Army. They cheered for the Bonus Army. They booed General MacArthur. Yesterday, these images began to reach Americans. It's the police in Oakland, California, breaking up the Occupy Wall Street protests there, Occupy Oakland. Part of the Occupy Wall Street movement is for economic justice. This one in California, the police moved in with batons swinging. They tore down tents and smashed signs. They sent tear gas grenades into the crowd. The cops are also alleged to have fired rubber bullets, something they are denying, despite injuries to protesters that look like they were caused by rubber bullets. The police admit to firing beanbag rounds, though. Frankly, when you look at the footage of this, it rather looked and sounded like a small war. Washington, D.C., 1932, the raid on the Bonus Army. Oakland, California, 2011, the raid on Occupy Oakland, Occupy Wall Street. 2 American scenes separated by almost a century. But put the old one in color, throw on some plaid shirts, and you almost could not tell them apart. In his story this week in New York Magazine, Frank Rich tells the story of the Bonus Army and of Occupy Wall Street. He titles it, quote, "The Class War Has Begun." Joining us now for the interview is Frank Rich. Frank, I'm so glad you could be here. Thanks for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, Rachel.
The scenes in Oakland this week were dramatic and upsetting. As we showed earlier tonight, one protester who's a young Iraq war veteran was reportedly seriously wounded in Oakland last night and is hospitalized. Does the use of force against these protests change their political impact?
It seems to. For instance, in New York, when this began, Bloomberg started out, there were some police actions, as we all know, that I think inflamed public opinion, again, sort of as in 1932, in favor of the Occupy Wall Street demonstrators. What happened in Oakland is horrifying, and I think will backfire, and if it's certainly not going to put out this movement, which just seems to be spreading and whose core issues are gaining in popularity, as the polls you've cited tonight show, by the minute.
The right has been trying, and elected Republicans, but really even more so from the conservative media, has been trying to demonize the protesters. Today, FoxNews.com started to say they were all acorn
Oh,
nice. They brought Acorn back,
Acorn's been pulled back out.
People like the former Fox News host, who now is just on the internet, I guess, Glenn Beck, was saying that this is a radical movement designed to destroy the American way of life, describing socialists and Islamists and all these other people. They're being derided as anti-American radicals. Is that what we should expect, or is that something potentially damaging to this?
I don't think it is potentially damaging, but interestingly, it's again what happened with the bonus army during the Depression. There was a lot of theories that they were communists. In fact, someone had the theory they were controlled by Jewish movie producers at MGM. I love that idea. And Secret Service was sent in to infiltrate the bonus army, but they couldn't find communists, or they found a few. What they mainly found were patriotic veterans out of work and desperate at a time, by the way, when, again, there was the highest income inequality until now. That was the biggest period. In 1928 was the last peak of it, and at a time when Congress had bailed out banks and railroads, set up a new agency under Hoover, and then adjourned for the summer, leaving the bonus army to be routed. So I think it's going to backfire. And I think also that sort of Fox News, Glenn Beck, they're speaking to people who are going to feel this regardless. I think that it's an echo chamber. The polls have been remarkable on this because they keep going up. Obama stayed away from this. Eric Cantor, on the other side, called them mobs when Occupy Wall Street started. Bloomberg was very critical. Then suddenly there was a Wall Street Journal, NBC News poll showing that 37% approved. Every poll since has gone up. Time had a poll, 54% of Americans approved the principles that the protesters are rallying behind. National Journal higher, the Times high, the Times CBS poll. So it keeps building.
There are two things at work here. There is the idea of what they stand for, which is anger at the sort of income inequality we were just talking about, and a sense of unfairness about who's gotten ahead and who's sort of getting away with it. Mm-hmm. And there is also the physical reality of the protest. And I wonder how important you see it is that this is a physical presence, that this is direct action, that this is not just an idea or a movement in concept, but a physical manifestation of this discontent.
Interestingly, I feel it's not always that important. They lit a fire. We live in a world unlike that of 1932, where we have a virtual reality in the form of social networking, different media. Things can move beyond the concrete corporal reality. So I feel, in a sense, if you go down to Zuccotti Park, it's very small. It's much smaller than the encampment of the bonus army, for instance. But it's lit a fire, and now it seems that it's sort of taking off on its own. I've been in Baltimore and Washington in the past 24 hours. They both had encampments. So obviously, this is going on all over the place. Oakland's another example. There are many, even in Europe. But in the end, I think when you look at those polls and you see the anger that's out there from people who aren't demonstrating at all, this is something that's building beyond the physical presence of people in tents and protesting.
In seeing the police confrontations, and some of these confrontations are terrifying. And certainly the police say they're being provoked in many cases, denying use of force that is obvious in some cases. Like in Oakland, a lot of these confrontations are very problematic, are very hard to watch. Mm-hmm. They're upsetting, and people are afraid. That said, I know from early in the protest, and I heard this from being there early in the protest, just going down to watch, people saying things like police are part of the 99% too. I heard people chanting, police need a raise, police need a raise.
Absolutely. Look, there'll always be crazy people and there'll always be provocateurs in any situation in the United States, no matter who it involves, regardless of politics. But I was last at Zuccotti Park on Sunday night, and it was exactly that. And the interchange between the police and the protesters there was completely polite, even when there were disagreements about where they should clear a certain passageway. And a lot of it was just people talking. Yeah. And almost like a teach-in in the 60s, people explaining their ideas, some more sophisticated than others.
That talking, the fact that the conversation has changed to be about this discontent, about this anger, about the sense of unfairness, that change of the discussion, I think, is the biggest impact that we have that we could hope for, and it's already happened.
It's remarkable to what extent it has.
Frank Rich, New York Magazine, your new piece on this is great. Thank you for reminding us all of the story of the Bonus Army and connecting those dots. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's wonderful.
Thanks. All right, tonight on The Last Word, Lawrence O'Donnell interviews Walter Isaacson, who's author of the blockbuster new biography of Apple's Steve Jobs. That's next. And on this show, we have a high-tech moment of geek involving the awesome high-tech legacy of Steve Jobs and Occupy Wall Street. It's sort of one of those days. Holistic. It is a smartphone world Mitt Romney, and that cuts both ways. I will explain. That's next.